Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the final of the first TDI World Championship. My name is Sajid. I'll be the chair for this round. I'd request my panelists to introduce themselves one by one.
Hi, I'm Brian. As Sajid just said, I'm also a panelist, as Sajid also just said. Very excited for this final. I'm sure it'll be great.
Hi, I'm Justin. I will also be paneling.
Hi, I'm Clarice. Good luck to all teams and congratulations for being in the final.
Hi, I'm Shodev. Best of luck to all the teams. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jade. Congrats for getting to the final, and yeah, good luck.
Awesome. In opening government, we have Korea Republic A. In opening opposition, we have Singapore A. In closing government, we have India B. In closing opposition, we have Singapore B. In the motion, this House would nationalize banks that require state support to guarantee their deposits. I would request the Prime Minister to begin this debate. Hear, hear.
With the recent collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, banks are now under close scrutiny. And in my speech, I'd like to, one, define the definitions, two, present the framing, and three, our first constructive about how states will run these banks better. But first, let's give some definitions. Nationalizing banks would look like it would belong to the state and it would be state run, right? And to fit this kind of requirement, they would have to have like state support. The state would have to donate money to them in order for them to be able to like fully give their deposits. Moving on to our framing. So leading on from our like definitions, these banks that require state support would most likely have the most important customers, because let's say you put like $1 million into a bank and then you need the deposit back plus interest rate. The thing is, unless you're like insanely rich or you're a business, you're not going to have that kind of money like laying around in your bank account. So that is to say that these banks have customers with immense amounts of money, tech startups, businesses, etc. Right? Okay. Thus, the bank, judge that the bank uses your money to make money and also gives you interest as a thank you, but states will not aim to profit massively off this endeavor, unlike banks. Okay, and finally, the last framing and characterization we would like to give you is that businesses get nervous at the same time because economic shocks and economic like downfalls and whatnot happen at the same time to everyone. Keep that in mind as we give you our speech. Moving on to our first constructive about how states will better run the banks. Note, judge and panel, that states are more conservative in terms of money because unlike banks, they are not profit driven, and unlike banks, they do not have the incentive to profit massively off of these endeavors, right? Thus, they will be less selfish in terms of money because they are just not profit driven. They also have a better understanding of how like a bank crisis could impact society, and they will probably be like wiser with giving out deposits and loans and treasuries and whatnot. Here we want to give you the example of Silicon Valley Bank, right? Silicon Valley Bank essentially was a bank that had massive amounts of companies putting their money in that bank. This looked like startups, usually from the tech industry, and it's called Silicon Valley Bank because a lot of companies from Silicon Valley Bank, like Google or whatnot, had like money in that bank. However, recently it went bankrupt. Why? The issue is that, as we told you in our framing, economic shocks, yes, I will accept PRs, economic shocks happen all around the same time, not now though, that meaning that when the market is unstable for one person, it's going to be unstable for the entirety of the market, meaning that companies are more likely to pull out of the bank and get their money back when the economy is weak, but they will all do it at the same time because these shocks happen to everyone at the exact same time. And that is precisely what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. Corporations, since they're in the same market and they're impacted the same way by like the same economic like fluctuations, they tried to pull out at the same time, leading to a massive bank run. That was Silicon Valley Bank's collapse. No judge though that Silicon Valley Bank required state support to guarantee their deposits. So how would this have looked different on our world? We think that the state would have been more careful with like the money that was given, because states now don't have to use the money that was deposited in their bank to get profit. As we said before, they're more conservative in terms of money. They don't have this massive need to like live and eat off of the profit they earn from the money that people are depositing, meaning that they would have been more careful, meaning that this bank run probably wouldn't have happened. Even if it had happened, Silicon Valley Bank probably would have the resources to still like pay back their deposits and not go bankrupt. I'll take a POI.
Ma'am, can you name an example of a rich billionaire who places his money in a bank that doesn't even have enough money and has to borrow from the government?
Yeah, we can give you an example. The CEO of Google. They literally put their money in Silicon Valley Bank, and Silicon Valley Bank went bankrupt. The CEOs of massive companies that had, like, okay, they're billionaires, right? They had their money in Silicon Valley Bank, and Silicon Valley Bank was widely known to receive state support to guarantee their deposits. So yes, we can give you an example, and we just did. Okay. The point is, though, when economic shocks happen, and they're inevitable, they will happen, bank runs will also happen, we at least can prevent it, and we can mitigate the harmful impacts. Why? Because we tell you that states will be more conservative with their money, since they don't have this massive need to profit. But additionally, because they are more conservative, they don't need to use this money for something else. They can just literally keep the money in the bank there, and they can just give it back when the deposits are needed. They don't have as much risk as the bank. They're a lot safer. Probably Silicon Valley Bank the bank run and bankruptcy wouldn't happen. Could be prouder to propose.
Thank you very much. Welcoming the Leader of Opposition to begin the opposition case.
Two responses for the Prime Minister today. We find their arguments are uncompelling and unrealistic. Firstly, they told us that states won't be selfish because they have no profit drive. The thing is, banks aren't selfish either. They just don't want money to be withdrawn from them. They can't control when and how people withdraw the money from their banks. We find that this is a mischaracterization. Furthermore, states won't be the ones that keep the money in the nationalization of banks. The banks will. And moreover, states won't be able to. Banks will still need to turn a profit. Nationalizing them doesn't change the fact that banks still need to turn a profit. Thus, their argument falls. Now, the PM also told us that they mitigate the harms of bank crashes. The problem is this is absolutely unrealistic. When you nationalize banks into states, the states will also be burdened with managing the financial crash. What this means is that when a financial crash happens, the state has to pay for it. From where? It has to come from things like social security. It has to come from things like defense. I'll talk more about this in my positive material. Now, some characterization of crashes. When a bank lends too much, or when people perceive a drop in the market or drop in the bank's ability to do things, people will withdraw their money from the bank. People who take too long to withdraw their money really can't, because the bank's principles run on the fact that trusting people won't try to withdraw their money all at once. Thus, they don't keep enough money in their reserves on hand for all customers to make withdrawals. So when banks lose money, they need to borrow. Both the economy and the people's money go down. There's less circulation of money. So this becomes a vicious cycle where when people spend less money, the economy goes down, thus people spend less money and withdraw their money, and the economy goes down again. It's a vicious cycle. So let's characterize the banks. Most are reliant on the government. And I mean a lot of banks are relying on the government for the state support. When they don't have enough money to return people's deposit, they need to ask the government for the money in order to ensure that people can take out their money. So the state support ensures that people can get their money back in status quo. So when they are greedy and attempt to spend people's monies, which means most of the time they don't have enough money in their deposits in order to return people their money. Because there's no alternative, people have no choice but to use these banks. And when these people withdraw the money, most of the time they're withdrawing the government's money, not the banks, not their own money. They have a limit, and even these governments have a limit on spending the government's money. So let's talk about the chain of events when banks become nationalized. When a bank crashes, people will obviously want to withdraw their money for it. There's no limit on how much people can withdraw, and the bank there's no limit on how much the bank can take from the government. So the nationalization will lead to an interlinkment of the bank and the government into one general entity. The government will have to divert money from other parts of the government. For example, this can come from, like I gave you before, social security, this can come from defense, and other important government programs which actually help people in the nation rather than just rich, spoiled billionaires. Yep, these programs require lots of money, and when money is taken away, bad things happen, such as when someone's social security is taken away, sometimes they can't afford to pay rent, sometimes they can't afford to keep the lights on, because these programs help people stay alive. So before I move on to my last point, can I
banks are likely to have more trust for these consumers when states help them, because they're now likely to think that they'll have a guaranteed deposit coming back, right? Isn't that better when you build more trust with states coming in and advising these kind of banks that could usually have popped up because of not having states?
I'm sorry, that was extremely unclear. But what I think you're trying to say is people won't have trust in them when states are important in charge of them. The fact is that people don't have trust in states in the first place. Most people. We're telling you that in most countries, people won't have trust in the government. So now imagine this, but on a larger scale. Imagine something like the scale of the 2008 Wall Street crash, where when the economy was disadvantaged because of a few greedy banks. Massive amounts of money will be required from the government, will be diverted from government programs, which will hurt the people relying on such programs, especially people relying on social security, as I mentioned. The government
the DPM to extend the opening government case.
Okay, panel, let's just start this debate again with a simple econ lecture, right? So basically, when you give your money to a bank, the bank doesn't keep it locked up in a vault like you see in cartoons, right? The bank loans that money out to other individuals that have to pay back the bank with an interest. That's how banks earn money in the first place, right? So basically, I think it's just evident that OO does not have a good understanding of how the banking system works in itself, because they seem to believe that banks can they seem to believe that banks basically don't have banks don't have an incentive to continuously loan out money to other individuals, even aside from the fact that the banks are actively gaining profit from that, right? Because people actively have to pay an interest rate when they return the money that they borrow to the bank. With that out of the way, right, let's just make one thing very clear. Banks, the banks that are all relied on the government in the first place, right? Just to clarify what they look like, the government only insures up to 250K in US dollars, right? For example, in the United States, right? Which is why bank runs are so devastating, because mostly companies deposit more than 250K in their bank accounts in the first place, meaning that if there is mass withdrawal, right, the government is only able to insure $250,000, where $250,000, right? And essentially these companies are probably not going to get the entire their entire deposit back, right? Never don't even expect them to pay back the interest rate. But also banks are only able to keep 10%. Banks only need to keep 10% of your deposit in the status quo, right? Because at the end of the day, banks can literally loan out the remaining 90% to other individuals for them to activate the economy and whatnot, right? Meaning that at the end of the day, they are able to make these extremely risky decisions with them only being required to keep 10% of the money that you deposit into them. That's why bank runs are devastating, because most of the money is either lost because people can't pay them back to the bank, right? Or they're already in the possession of other individuals, because again, banks don't just create money out of nowhere and give you back interest rate. That interest is basically the bank telling you, bank saying thank you for letting us use your money to fund other people and whatnot, right? But also, why is this different when it's a state-run bank, right? So firstly, we've already clarified why the state is much better actor in terms of handling these deposits, because the state's probably not going to keep only 10% of the deposits. They're probably going to have, let's say 20, 30, right? They're going to have a significantly increased percent of money that they're going to keep into accounts without lending them out, because the states understand the devastating implications of bank runs, right? But they also understand the implications of the economic implications of these companies losing out on billions of dollars, right? Which I'll explain later on, right? But also we believe that firstly, that's going to a state-run banking system means that there's going to be significantly more credit, because the state is generally seen as a more reliable actor than individual banks, right? This means that firstly, there's going to be more deposits that can be loaned out, which is just good for the economy in general, right? But secondly, there are going to be less bank runs, because even in times of financial crisis, right, the assumption is that the state is capable of dealing with things. things, or at least that's the expectation, meaning that less people are likely to actually just like suddenly panic, right? Whereas when it's an individual actor such as a bank, right, it's much more likely that people will panic, and that's what causes bank runs to happen, because people lose trust in individual entities very easily. But before I move on, I'll take a PY.
Okay, yes. So do you feel that the government is the best in regulating companies that handle large or small amounts of money?
Sorry, can you say that again, please?
Or do you feel that the government is the best in regulating companies that handle
the government is the best actor, because government is probably not just going to keep 10% of the money. They're going to go with the more conservative route, because the government literally face immense backlash if they screw up the economy by basically loaning out massive proportions, like let's say like even 90%, and like even if the government just follows the current regulations and loans out 90%, and if they screw up the economy by basically having a massive banking run where they're unable to provide, like, give money back to citizens, back to the people who made the deposit. But also, like OO said, right, government's probably going to get the money from, like, if there is a bank run, the government's probably going to need to take it away from other state spending, meaning that they have active incentive to go to the more conservative route, because they don't want to, like, basically take away from other portions of the state spending, and they actually are under the constantly under the scrutiny of the public, right? But moving on to our team's last argument, which is the economic implications, right? So again, these companies are basically the largest part of the economy. Let's just take a look at what economic devastations under these companies, under bank runs, regarding these companies looks like, right? Because at the end of the day, there's not really a lot of companies that's on like Samsung or Apple's level in terms of the profit they make with their product. Meaning that, let's say in the US, if a bank mismanages the money that Apple deposited as a company, right, it's going to be extremely harmful, especially if a country is very reliant on that one manufacturer monopolizing the industry within that country, right? For example, if Apple is like the main manufacturer of mobile phones in the United States, and if Apple simply drops out because the banks are not able to actually make like quote unquote good decisions in regards to money, right, they're going to be very easily beaten up by competitors, let's say Samsung, meaning that the profit will go to Samsung because people are going to because people really don't have an alternative than buying Samsung phones, which leads to monopoly, which obviously intuitively is bad because it means that not a lot of competition nor innovation can arise, right? But also, in the best case scenario, this is probably going to lead to a duopoly or oligopoly, which is harmful anyways, because at the end of the day, we believe that a few handful of companies keeping basically holding the economy at a chokehold isn't that good for the economy, right? Couldn't be prouder to propose.
Thank you. DLO, please.
A group is only as strong as its weakest link. When you peg the government to an extension in the form of a bank who cannot guarantee deposits, if they crash, when they end up crashing, the harm becomes even more widespread, and more people suffer as a result. The majority of rebuttals are integrated into my material, but here are some direct responses. First, I want to point out that the entirety of opening government's case was to say that we should be nationalizing and integrating banks who take risks, because the state should somehow babysit divert their own resources to babysit banks who end up flying and then falling. Next, when they say that companies are going to lose out severely when these banks don't nationalize, okay, Silicon Valley Bank went bankrupt and shuttered, so I can still use Google. The majority of resources most people need in the status quo in today's world still are going to remain. Not everyone is going to be affected on such a major scale that they claim happens. But neither speakers wanted to acknowledge that the biggest group of people who get harmed on their side, the proletariats, the middle class, the poor, they keep society going, and you take away all the social security because now governments have to divert resources to keeping these banks afloat when they want to take risks. The reason why a lot of them crash in the status quo is because they have such ridiculously high interest rates that they want to get, so that all the rich people who go out and invest in their banks are going to get even more money than they already have right now. But let me move on to my positive material. Let's talk about competition first, because we think that it's better that you make strong banks more powerful on our side by reducing competition. In the status quo, we see that there is an oversaturation of available banks for clients to deposit their money in. The existence of many banks, including stuff like Silicon Valley Bank and all the others that are currently going bankrupt right now, creates too much competition, because now you have even more banks beckoning clients to invest in them. Because all these banks, especially smaller banks, which they say all the rich people invest in, they take ridiculously risky interest rates with the promise of inflating the client's deposit, which means that crashes are going to be even worse. And this is why that when they crash, they need the state to bail them out, and the state has to spend even more resources so that their clients can go get back their money. Look, and this directly responses to opposition to government. The competition is bad for two reasons. First, because the existence of banks crashing creates more panic whenever a series of these crashes occur, but it's already happening in the status quo. You can see how Silicon Valley Bank has speed like precipitated all these other crashes that are happening right now. There's going to be more bank runs, there's going to be higher risks, and to the extent that they say that people are going to lose money, yes, even more money is going to be lost that can't be circulated anymore. You make but the more important thing is that you make the most prominent banks in your country not as strong as that they could be. Look, when it comes down to nationalizing, it compounds these effects on their side by affirming too many of these weak banks. Not even weak, let's say they have some money, yes, but they take too many risks, and I don't think that it's the responsibility of the state to have to babysit them and use all their resources, and to use a significant amount of their resources that could otherwise be diverted somewhere else in order to keep these banks afloat, or in order to guarantee that the clients are going to get the deposits back when these banks crash. Most important customers move into these prominent banks on our side, which means that not only do these banks get stronger, but it means that more people are going to be confident in these banks, reducing the panic, reducing the severity whenever anything happens, like the financial situation, like material rates, meaning that less people are going to suffer, less people are going to lose so much money. And more importantly, it equalizes the playing field. Let's talk about what nationalization looks like. But before that, I'll take a POI.
Yeah, so banks are actually more likely to make riskier investments. We see this with SVB and Yes Bank as well. So why should banks not be helped by the government, considering their investments are actually more risky?
Because you have to realize when it doesn't come to the most prominent banks, when it comes to the banks such as SVB that all these rich people are investing in, their selling point is that they take an even higher risk so that their clients can get even more money. And we think that this is a risk that the government simply cannot accept when they try to nationalize these banks and take them under their wing. Moving back, let's talk about what nationalization looks like. Yes, you end up managing the banks with your own resources as the government. Yes, they already have to already guarantee the deposits and the status quo. That's what this debate is about, right? But the important question, of course, opening government wants to protect the coffers of all the rich billionaires, of Jeff Bezos, etc., right? But let's be real. When it comes to Silicon Valley Bank's website, when they say they're actually helping tech startups, no, that's not true. A lot of the people who invest are going to be the rich billionaires. So if it is at the top 0.01% who are affected by the fall of these banks, what does it matter that they lose some of their money? There is no impetus for the government to care about these people in the first place because they really have the resources to stay afloat on their own, even if these banks crash, even if these banks shutter. Look, if they lose their money, so be it. They still get to keep a majority of their resources because they are that powerful financially. People who deposited in SVB literally are the kind who demanded for things such as student college debt to not be forgiven, putting the people who are actually at the heart of this society, the majority of students, they are simply affirming their suffering because now they have even more debt to pay back. These are the problems of society that we've been telling you about. Because of these reasons, first, the states don't need to worry about high risk of the nationalized banks going bankrupt. Secondly, it doesn't matter if they crash because these banks take too much risk and end up suffering greatly as a result. What do you expect a gamble to do? Like what? What do you expect to do? Give you money? Think about that as I end the opening half and go with opening up.
Thank you for that. To begin the closing half debate, I'd like to welcome the member of government.
All right, judges. So first, let's look at actually what the structure of my speech is going to look like. So first, I'll actually be talking about my rebuttals. And then after this, I'll essentially be extending and explaining why we analyze this debate better and giving you key impacts on this debate. Now, first, let's actually look at what the OO replied in the POI session. They said that the investments will, the high risk factor is what invites these people. However, we refute this by telling you how when it becomes nationalized, automatically it will mean that there will be better investments. They have advisories in place. When these advisories are in place, it leads to more attraction for these people. They will be better investments as well. And this is key here. So we actually turn their argument and we say, once nationalized banks, when banks become nationalized, and what the resolution does, essentially there will be more attraction to these banks. And that's why it's better. Now, first, they tell you how banks won't be selfish, Judge, but don't actually flow this. We tell you how banks are selfish. In the past, they have invested in risky bonds alone, and they will continue to do so. And that's why we tell you why state support is required. State support is required for these reasons. And because of this limiting trust factor, and we're going to analyze that further about this whole trust factor that needs to be built and that the government provides them. Otherwise, they don't. And now the OO, they don't provide no mechanism, right? The only possible mechanism they tell you is that banks have to then like borrow later, like from the Federal Reserve, etc. Right? Now, let me explain the problem with this. When banks start borrowing from the Federal Reserve itself, it will also lead to a lowering in interest rates because they want more people to invest in their banks, right? In bonds, right? So when there's low interest rates, what actually happens is inflation. Inflation is a huge problem, right? So inflation is extremely detrimental, and that's what will happen on their side. However, on our side, when when we get nationalized state support, this won't happen by actually benefiting people. So now I'll actually be extending and explaining why this is important to us, right? So now the first thing we actually talk about is why it helps in safeguarding the economy. Nationalizing helps with safeguarding the economy. First, we'll explain why it's better on the long term, right? It's better on the long term because it will, when you guarantee these deposits, more people are more likely to go to these banks, and this will lead to them sticking for the long term as well. The interest rates will change, and that's why it will lead to better impact of how inflation decreases. And that's the link we provide you here that the OG fails to give. So Judge, the CG tells you how we also give you a nuanced impact of how the inflation decreases, right? Now, we also will talk about this whole trust factor, right? When the government comes, there's obviously better advisories, right, in place. So it means that there's also more investment done by the banks in safer investments. Why safer investments is important is what we'll tell you, because when states actually guarantee these bonds, they gain more trust from investors themselves and people putting money in the bank. That's the key logical link, right, that we're providing to you. And we explain why this is important. Well, it's important because we tell you how once people gain more trust, it actually means it helps with both the government's credibility and also their own investments. So we're actually impacting three stakeholders. One, we're impacting the banks, we're improving the banks. Second, we're also impacting the government as well. They're gaining more credibility. And third, we also benefit the citizens as there's more, better, safer investment. Now, we'll also extend by telling you how it benefits the people specifically. One, obviously, them safer investments, and we'll explain why as well. Right, because there's more advisory that's better. And then again, the deposits are guaranteed. When they're guaranteed, people actually go out there more, they start to invest more, and they put in money in the banks as well. And now this also builds better credibility for the government, and the government wants credibility today. Because of this, it will build an immense amount of trust, and trust is the link we give you here. Why we analyze trust, Judge, because trust is what each government entity wants as a body for votes, etc. as well. And that's why we're better than the OG here as well. We explain this, we analyze this, and we tell you how trust is extremely influential. And that's why the government should do this. They build trust with its citizens, and when they build trust with citizens, it is much more beneficial. So now I'd like to take a POI before carrying on.
Who does your site help? The top 1% or the bottom 30%?
Okay, yeah. So we'll actually answer this by telling you it helps both, right? Now, let me explain why it helps the top 1%. It helps the top 1% because it helps and safeguard their investments, of course, as well. Now we'll also add on how when their investments are safeguarded, etc. When companies safeguard their investments are safeguarded, what they actually do is they start hiring more people, right? They hire people in the bottom 30%. They start hiring more people. Moreover, after this as well, they have policies that have in the company itself. The benefits they give to the employees, moreover, is also strengthened. When these benefits are strengthened, you're also helping the bottom 30%. So, Judge, this is a new nuanced argument, and we explain why this is actually beneficial to both sides of the world. And that's why, Judge, is better to nationalize the bank. Moreover, we'll give you an example of Yes Bank, how the government failed, how Yes Bank failed, and then the government had to save them, and now there's been return investment in Yes Bank. And moreover, the SVB, it gives loans, the government supports it, it's led to more innovation and startups. Startup culture increases, so automatically unemployment, etc., decreases as well, and that's why it helps. And now we'll also show you on how it's bad as the FDIC discourages and has deposits, right? And that's why that's detrimental. So that's why we tell you, Judge, on our side, we analyze better. And therefore, please vote for the closing government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the closing opposition, I'd like to welcome the member of opposition.
Panel, what we've seen from the other three teams in this debate is a huge amount of tunnel visioning in, first on economic collapse, second on the nature of safeguarding local business, and thirdly, no consideration at all for the nature of banks and the nature of the government. So what we heard from the CG previously was that we should have more attraction for local banks because foreign banks are really selfish. They're gonna rip off the people. And we're gonna say that, yes, these banks are selfish, but they're smart. They're not going to destroy their customer reputation by investing into hugely risky bonds and compromising the trust that people put in them. And next, they go on and on about safeguarding local businesses by nationalizing these banks. However, on our side, we believe that safeguarding business has become the euphemism for protectionism and cutting off gradually ties with the outside world. Now, when a local business loses trust among the people as an extremely unfriendly business partner, what's going to happen is that outside companies are going to see that, for example, this country has taken in the people's money in order to safeguard their own businesses. They are not a friendly business partner. There's no trust on the side of business. And even as a citizen, this trust is diminished when states are involved Because when I see the government playing whack-a-mole with these weak banks and trying to squash and own all the banks that they can, I'm definitely not going to trust the government with my money. Now, on to my substantive material, 2 extensions for the House today. Firstly, on protectionism. Secondly, on how this is a violation and a compromise of the fundamental human right to self-determination. Now, what's the nature of banks? The nature of a bank is to have the people's trust. The people's trust to put their savings, money that they have worked hard for, into these banks in order for these banks to, first of all, safekeep them, and also for the personal gain of these people. Now, on our side, we say that all companies need money to succeed, bar none. And state support is entirely justified. However, our side draws the line when states try to own these banks as their assets. Now, why is this the case? Because when a government takes in, for example, a small startup bank that really doesn't have much of a reputation among the people, the precedent that is set is extremely dangerous. Now, I'm going to raise the example of Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is a small bank in Singapore that the government technically owns, but it's a small bank precisely because people don't trust it. People don't trust what the government is going to do with this money. When a government takes control of a bank and soft forces investment from the people into these state banks because they are more stable and because of the promise that they're going to hold still under economic downturn, the implications of this are huge. What's stopping the government from doing whatever they want with the people's money? Because all they need to do to maintain this trust is to repay the people. It's a false pretense of trust that our side simply cannot allow to stand. Well, what this looks like is a misinvestment on the side of the government. It's circular investment into local companies. It's fortifying local companies, shutting them out from the outside world because they have the people to extort from in order to make these actions. And what's going to happen is when lobbyists are involved, it's an avenue to satisfy lobbyists. And because these lobbyists because these governments no longer have to make promise to these foreign companies to safeguard the business within these countries. Now, on to my second extension about how this is a violation of the human right to self-determination. Now, when a startup bank is the one that's receiving state support currently in the status quo, we believe that it's firstly extremely unfair, and it compromises not only established banks, and the government is essentially touting these smaller banks as the more trustworthy source of investment because they can't survive without state support. Before I continue, any POIs?
Yeah, so I like spending my money to gamble. Should gambling be legal?
I completely do not understand your example. However, if you really want to draw a link between gambling and banks, I'm quite sure that the governments have a huge say in what happens in casinos. And when we do the same with the people's investment system, it's extremely problematic. Now, outside of the fact that it's simply illogical for a government to push forward a small bank as a reliable source of investment, it's also a violation of the human right of people to choose what institutions they want to invest their money with. It's their own money, for God's sake. When we make the people feel insecure about where they put their money in, we are taking away their right for self-determination, because you are taking away the ability, you are compromising the ability of these people to choose what companies they want to invest in, to choose what they want to do with their money. Now, when the state comes in and tells you that, hey, look at this bank. This bank is small, but it's the most trustworthy you can do, they can invest in. The people are going to be soft-forced into investing into these banks and opening the avenue, setting an extremely worrying precedent for the pushing forward of protectionism, for seclusionism, and most of all, a violation of our right to do what we want with our money. For these reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. For the last speech from government side, Government Whip, please.
Judge, side opposition's main arguments revolve around 3 main assumptions. First, banks are not selfish and are very smart. 2, that there is not going to be any trust between banks, the government, and the people. And 3, the government is taking over the banks completely and taking charge of them. I think all of these 3 assumptions, if proved wrong, can clearly prove why the opposition loses this debate, and I'll do that in 3 main ways. First, rebutting the OOCO. Second, giving my extension and why do they matter in this debate? And finally, weighing overall, even on the most charitable case of the opposition. If you look at the three main assumptions of this case, the first on banks not being selfish, I think it's important to understand that this can be easily rebutted in two ways. First, banks are very clearly going for a selfish motive because they still want to get this kind of profit, right? They're still, sure, they're going to build this trust and they're very smart. The thing is that they're smart in building the trust of the people. They're not smart in making the kind of investments that they want because they invest in riskier ones because of the profit-driven motive that they actually have. And we see this in the two examples that we provide you. One, we see this in the example of Yes Bank, which in India made riskier investments. That is why it had a bank run. But second, we also see in the SVB investment, and we give you more analysis on why SVB failed, right? It failed because of the bad, weaker bonds that it invested in. And we see that in something which is better than the OG that we do, is we give you the analysis. It's because of the kind of bank run that they have. It's because of the kind of weaker investments that they made that these banks actually lost their profit. And that's why these banks are more likely to go towards profits. And that's why they're more selfish, which is why they make riskier investments. But two, also, I think it's better to understand that government coming in and government giving more money and nationalizing this bank solves for this and makes these banks less selfish, because now nationalizing them means more people are going to come in, which means that these banks are now going to understand and incentivize themselves to work better and make safer long-term investments because they have so many people on the line. Secondly, then moving on to the second assumption, they talk about how not having trust, right? You get this from OO, and CEO's arguments are largely derivative of this, that there are no trust any which ways on the bank, and the government will not have any trust any which ways with the people. I think this is also wrong on three main reasons. First, I think government is likely to build this trust when they're guaranteeing more money being put back into the citizens' deposit, putting the money back into the citizens' hands, which means that the government are more likely to be trusted on our side of the world because at least we're guaranteed the kind of deposit back. On your side of the world, what do we see is if you look at the example of SVB, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company comes in and caps the amount of money that you can give back in deposits, which is like $250,000 if I'm not wrong. But the point here is that the FDIC is capping the amount of money that can come back in deposits, which means that these people are now less likely to trust the government because you put a cap at the amount of money you're guaranteeing them back. But if the government is guaranteeing them back the money that they already get from before, the people are more likely to trust the government again, which means that there is a trust between these banks and the government. This is the link you don't get in OG, you get this in CG, weigh this on flow this from CG as well. But second, Dutch will also tell you about more investment into banks. The fact that there is more trust into the banks and the fact that we have established the link on having more trust into the banks means that these companies and these people are more likely to pay back to the bank, make more deposits to the bank, which is holistically better off for the economy, as banks are usually considered a safer investment. And this works better for the economy when a nationalized bank is being invested more into, which means the economy has more money flowing in, which is better for the economy in the long term. The third thing which we get again from OO and CO is that they tend to be risky with government money. The banks will be riskier with government money. I think this is again misleading redundant because we tell you about the idea that government nationalizing them incentivizes them to become better banks because more people are coming in, which already mitigates this idea as well. So you flow this to us. But we also study the idea of how we are considering helping only the top 1%, not the top 20%. I think we rebut this by telling you, one, the top 1% are better off in our world because they make better and safer investments, like for the startup that are going for, because now the companies are more trusted into the banks. But secondly, top 30% are also better off because one, if these companies are better off on our side, they're more likely to increase the employment, increase wages. So these top 30%, the middle class is better off. But secondly, George, since these banks are now considered safe and people trust these kind of banks, people are more likely to make investments back into these banks, which is why the top 30% is also better off, largely making the arguments of CO and OO redundant. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
So exactly how many of these banks do you think the state can take on?
I think the state can take on a quite amount of banks, even if you put into the bank run. I think the idea isn't here to give you a number into how many banks that I can put as use the state money. The point here is that the state money is still going to help these banks a lot, right? Because it's going to build up the trust, which is extremely important because that flows more money into the economy, which leads to more employment, more wages. And I think the fact that if you're able to generate more money in the economy, which means we can nationalize more banks, which is again better off. Now, coming on to the why extensions matter on our side of the case, right? I think it's important to understand because OG's arguments are more about how states are more conservative and less profit driven, right? But why are states less profit driven? We give the link of the idea of trust. It is important to understand that trust is more important on our side and it's better off on our side because they're guaranteeing the amount of money that they're getting back, which means they're more likely to get these money back, and which means the government is more likely to build the trust with the citizens, which means more people are likely to put back money into back investments back into the government, the banks as well. And over on the long term, the trust that we tell you, the link that we give you, which OG misses on, it's better off because there's less interest rates, which means less inflation happens over the long term, and which is why it's better off on our side. Also, we talk about bank runs and more deposits. I think we give you, again, this is too specific of an argument from OG, and we make this more generalized by talking about the trust and how safer investments are made by the people. If you look at the most charitable case of side opposition, I think they lose in the very two idea that one, they have less trust into banks, and two, more inflation increases is that as there is less investment. Based on these kind of cases, you have to flow this debate to CG. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. For the last speech of the debate, Op Whip, please.
I think all sides that can agree that money is the stepping stone, the cornerstone, the foundation upon all businesses are built on. All businesses, bar none, including banks. Banks need money to survive, especially when you start fledgling banks. So before I go on to address everything, right, I feel that the characterization of banks in debate has been completely misstrued, except for what my earlier speaker came up and told you. Because right, everyone all told us that, oh, some of them told us that these were ginormous banks who had like massive capabilities and massive lending power, and they were so power hungry. But the real fact of the matter is that if you're a large bank, right, you don't need government support. You can really draw from reserves, and the only case in which you need government support is like an economic crisis, which honestly doesn't happen really that often. And number three, right, these banks often have like reserves and like analysts to monitor when these economic crises are going to happen, so they can very well manage it by themselves. So what are we looking at for these characterization of banks who actually need to draw money from the government in order to survive? We are talking about banks who have just started up, banks who are just struggling to find a place in society, banks are struggling to provide money to those in society. And the very fact is that banks at the heart and the core, they are businesses too, and all businesses need money when they first start out. So what you're doing is essentially number one, denying themselves the money, and number two, they're doing something that every single other company does, right? All they're doing is just simply borrowing money, except that the lender is now the government. And also, right, there's also this misconstruing that, oh, right, when these companies, right, borrow money from the government, they're going to take so much that the government doesn't have any money left. But this is completely illogical, because I believe that the government can obviously regulate the amount of money that they're going to hand out to these industries, right? It's not as if these industries are endless tap of money in which they can draw from the government. So now I'll be addressing like the problems case by case. So first, OG comes up and states that the government better runs corporations, but in fact what they're essentially advocating is just protectionism. They're saying, oh, companies are profit making, therefore companies are bad. So your socialist line of thinking doesn't actually quite fit in with like our democratic society here. You are essentially relying on the North Korea economic model in which the government is the best party to run all anything that handles money, which is completely unequivocal. It's to say, oh, the people have trust in the government, right? So therefore the government must run corporations. What is this line of thinking? It simply blows my mind to see how you can just say that, oh, the government is always the best person to run corporations, when it isn't the case. We already know how corporations boost business, they boost the economy, and they provide jobs for the people. And we see how nationalizing industries and protectionism really doesn't work. For example, take the case of Singapore, right? Singapore did nationalize a few industries, but only the crucial ones like Singtel Communications. But Singapore was extremely friendly towards other industries and welcomed them all in. And we see that Singapore is a booming metropolis and a hub for companies to arrive in. So it's completely unequivocal. So I restated, I asked you in my POI that if you said that government was the best one to run society. So yes. So thank you very much for running protectionism, but I'm afraid we're not buying that argument. So now moving on to the flaws of opening opposition. So they cure tunnel visioning on the idea of like exaggerated banks. So they say that, oh, you see, right, all these banks, right, all they're doing is just like they're tunnel vision on issues that, oh, these banks are going to collapse, like the issue that these banks are going to collapse is always at the back of their minds. But the fact is just assuming that the banks are not going to collapse. The main issue at hand is democracy. The main issue at hand is the state deciding which companies get to survive, which companies don't, and the state stamping out little fledgling companies who are just trying to survive and just absorbing it into a massive cesspool of money that they have. And also they talk about how saturation competition is good. Wait, before I continue, any POIs?
Yeah, so why does SVB not exist anymore?
Sorry, SV what?
Why does SVB not exist anymore?
Silicon Valley Bank was just simply isolated example, right? When I asked you in the POI, I literally could not give any other examples other than Silicon Valley Bank. And literally there's negligible impact because we see, oh, a bank collapses. So what? Like Google is still running, their servers are still on, we can still access the internet. Like your POI doesn't make sense at all. So now moving on to like the closing government. So they say, oh, these banks, right? Yes, they are smart, but they are so greedy that they're going to gobble all the money that they have and destroy themselves in the process. But yes, right, banks essentially need profit, but to get profit, they need trust from the masses. Like trust is very important aspect of banking. And what happens when you seize control of businesses as the government? You're diminishing trust in you're diminishing the companies, the trust that companies have in you. You're diminishing the trust that the people have in you. You're destroying democracy. And the very fact of the matter is that government, they also talk about how government nationalism is so bad, how it's going to happen, but they never actually explains the process. But we really understand that government nationalism means the state runs it, right? If the state, if a country is
if a company is nationalized, it means the state owns it, so the state can do literally whatever the hell the state wants with it. So like, and they also talk about the issue of like the banks drawing infinite amount of money from like government, which I already refuted earlier. So essentially, right, the reason why you should go with like closing opposition, because we're the side that actually makes sense. Because we aim at the main crucial issue at the debate, which is the issue of democracy and the role of the government in managing businesses. And when you neglect these two priorities in the aspect of chasing economic so-called freedom, you essentially neglect the whole issue of fundamental issue of democracy and the right that companies and people have to exist and make choices. Thus, I'm so happy to oppose.
Thank you for the debate, everyone. Please cross the floors virtually, shake hands, and we'll see you very soon at the award announcements.
Thank you for
Thank
joining
you.
us.
For the debate.